A few years ago, a remarkable and very interesting man died in Japan. He was 91 years old and his name was Hiro Onoda. Hiro Onoda was a young soldier in World War II, sent by the Imperial Japanese Army to go to an island in the Philippines on December 26, 1944. 2 months later, the island was occupied by the Allied forces. Onoda fled to the hills. He had been given instructions never to surrender, and he took these instructions very seriously indeed. In those days, remember, the Japanese still regarded their emperor as a god, to whom absolute loyalty was owed. For the next 30 years, Lieutenant Onoda carried on the war, and following his instructions meticulously, never surrendered. The first time he was told that the war had actually come to an end was near the end of 1945, when a pamphlet was dropped around him saying, "The war ended August 15th. Come down from the mountains already." Onoda picked up the pamphlet, read it, shook his head, and said, "American propaganda." He didn't believe it. Then the Japanese themselves came up with pamphlets to be airlifted over the place where he was, telling him that hostilities had come to an end and ordering him back home. He shook his head and said, "American propaganda." And so he continued hiding out there and inflicting raids on the villages and towns of the island. In the early 50s, they tried another tactic. His own family wrote him letters and sent him pictures which were airlifted over the hills and jungles where he was hiding. He opened the letters, read them, and decided that the Americans must have installed a puppet government in Tokyo, and so this was nothing but propaganda to get him to surrender. After nothing had been heard from him for a while, in 1959 the Japanese declared him dead. Well, that wasn't quite true, because the villagers around there knew quite well that there was some mysterious guy up in the hills who would come down and burn their rice fields and raid their towns and villages. Finally, in 1974, almost 30 years after the end of World War II, a young Japanese hippie boy by the name of Norio Suzuki, an adventurer and explorer, heard about this renegade Japanese soldier still hiding out in the jungles of the Philippines. This young explorer boy set out on an adventure, saying, "I am going to find Lieutenant Onoda, a panda bear, and the abominable snowman," in that order. So the young man set out, and after 4 days of searching the mountains and jungles of the island, he came across the old soldier, still dressed in his tattered army uniform of decades before. Onoda would have shot the boy on the spot, as he had been shooting everything that moved for the last 3 decades. But the young explorer knew his psychology. He said to the old man, "Onoda-san, the emperor and the people of Japan are worried about you, and I have come to see how you are." They began to converse, and for many days they spoke, and they became friends. The young man tried to get the old soldier to come out of the jungle, to come down from the mountains, and to go home to Japan. Still the old man refused. He said, "I will never surrender. I will never come down until I am instructed to do so by a superior commander." So the young Japanese boy went home to Japan and looked up the officer who had been in charge of Lieutenant Onoda so many years before. This officer was an old man, of course, and was working in a bookstore. He was told the story, and then the Japanese government sent him over to the Philippines, accompanied by this young hippie explorer. They found the old soldier, and the officer commanded him to lay down his arms and return home. And so, after 30 years, his private World War II finally came to an end. We all receive calls to come down from a mountain, or calls to go up a mountain, calls to come out of a jungle, or calls perhaps to go into one. We receive calls to follow God. We receive calls to love. Time after time during our life, we too find these pamphlets dropped at our feet, telling us that the war is over, calling us to something greater. Time after time, we run into messengers, perhaps our teachers, perhaps our parents or family members, or later on in life, many other types of messengers. Time after time, we refuse to believe. We refuse to accept the call. Time after time, we read the messages, hear the voices, but we shake our heads and say, "Propaganda! I am staying put where I am." Jesus walks down the beach and runs into some people fishing. He calls some of them by name, tells them, "What you are doing is good, but you could be doing something much better. Remain fishermen, but you can fish for something much bigger than that." And they answered the call. What are we being called to do? How are we being called to live? The French writer Émile Zola once said, "If you ask me what I came to do in the world, I, as an artist, will tell you I am here to live out loud." To live out loud. All of us are living, but are we all truly living out loud? Are we all truly living the life we could be living? Are we responding to the call to live fully? We are called to live out loud. We are called to fish for bigger things. We are called to end our little wars. We are called repeatedly. We find the pamphlets, messages dropped at our feet, dropped into our hands. We encounter the messengers constantly being sent to us. Come out of your private jungle. Come down from your mountain. There are higher mountains for you to ascend, deeper jungles for you to penetrate. Your life is not a war. The people around you are not your enemies. They are your sisters and brothers. The emperor you thought you had been serving is not a god after all. The life you thought you had been living is not the real one, not the highest one. But there is a God, a true one, who summons you to live, to truly live. And the name of that God is love. Surrender to that God. Come out of your jungle. Fish for bigger things. Live out loud.